Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with Sara F. Shacter, author of Georgia Watson and the 99% Campaign. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with this week's interview. Hello, Sara. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. And can you start us off by introducing yourself for the audience and the book that we'll be discussing?
Sure. My name is Sara Shacter. I am a children's book writer. I do picture books in middle grade and some nonfiction as well. And the book today we're going to be talking about is Georgia Watson and the 99% Campaign, which is my debut middle grade novel.
And a lot of times there's been a trend I've noticed where the character's name will be front and center in the book's title. So,
Hmm.
just in your own words, who is Georgia Watson?
Georgia is a science loving sixth grade girl. At the beginning of the book, she is starting sixth grade with her very first friend ever. She's moved a whole lot, and she's very excited for the beginning of sixth grade. So, as readers of novels, you know something has to go wrong. But she is very kind and very earnest, um, and has a very good heart.
And you said that something has to go wrong. I think it was Alex Gino on this podcast who said stories need conflict. Can you get into what that conflict is for us?
Yes. For her, you've got your outer arc, right? Your plot arc and your inner arc. So her emotional arc is she begins the story feeling very lonely, really. She's got one good friend, which she's ecstatic about. She's never really had a good friend before. She feels a little detached from her parents, just feels they're very loving parents, but she just feels very different than they are. The one person who she really felt connected to in a deep way was her grandfather who has passed away a year or two previously. So she just feels very disconnected. And that is where her inner arc meets the outer arc. So,
And you said that she has one friend. You're talking, of course, of Izzy. Can you tell us who Izzy
yeah.
is?
Yeah, Izzy is also a very science-oriented sixth-grade girl, and they just love exploring the world together, and they're just super like-minded. So it looks like sixth grade is off to a great start.
It absolutely is with Georgia and Izzy both excited for an upcoming science camp and wanting to go, as well as starting the sixth grade, which is some schools split it up, either fifth grade or sixth grade, being the end of elementary school. So Georgia kind of
Mhm.
feels like she is about to enter this wider world, and that meshes very well with her natural curiosity and her love for science and exploration and experimentation and learning. And so that kind of gets us into the inciting incident for the plot where Georgia learns about how heritable traits pass on. And can you talk a little bit about what this incident is in the library that kind of kickstarts the plot?
Sure, sure. So Georgia is loves science, and so the first science unit of sixth grade is one on heredity. So her teacher teaches them about dominant traits and recessive traits, and she's super fascinated by the whole thing. um, and so she goes into the library during lunch, and she's looking for a project to do with Izzy. She and Izzy love to do projects together, and she really wants to do something that's going to impress her teacher because, as you mentioned, they're hoping to go to the science camp over this summer after sixth grade. You need a recommendation to go. So she's thinking, well, what can I do that would be really cool? And she starts to think, well, maybe we could do something about heredity. So she gets this idea that maybe they can take pictures of celebrities and put them together and predict what their kids will look like based on dominant and recessive traits. So she tries it, just experimenting with some pictures from her classmates from fifth grade from the previous year. Um, and it's going really well, and it's really interesting. Um, and then she adds one more which is a sort of mean version of a girl named Nicole who is a bully and has really given Georgia a lot of grief. And so she doesn't really do a dominant recessive trait version of her. She just does sort of a mean picture of her, um, a little cathartic. And then she's going to leave, and she goes to delete her pictures. But there's a little boy in the lab, in the computer lab, who runs by, knocks into her. She accidentally ends up hitting the print button, and her printouts get swiped by somebody else and disseminated, and social chaos ensues, as I like to say.
You had mentioned how Georgia is feeling kind of disconnected from her parents, and she learns
Yeah.
about a famous inventor that she is distantly related to. Do you think that this kind of reflects the narrative and the message of of heritable traits with dominant and recessive genes? Kind of like how Georgia is really interested in science, but her parents don't seem to be.
Yeah. So, yeah, she finds out she's related to Watson of Bell and Watson and the phone, distantly related, and is thrilled to think that she has actual cells from or actual genetic material from an actual inventor. But what she also learns throughout the book is that there's a real intersection between science and creativity. Um, in order to discover new things, you have to think differently and be creative and think outside the box. And her parents are both very creative, and she realizes that she really is connected with them, but in a different way than she had anticipated. So that's a nice sort of subplot for her throughout the book.
Science goes along with creativity. You have to be able to think differently, think outside the box, kind of put together ideas in creative ways. And I think that that goes really well with the first day of sixth grade in Mr. C's classroom when he has them drawing pictures of monsters. And at first, Georgia
Yeah.
doesn't understand what the point is of this assignment. Do you think that this is something that readers are going to be able to understand, seeing that sometimes things that they don't always see a connection of, things they don't always see a connection between, kind of link together as a way to kind of bolster and strengthen learning?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. That's was one of my intentions when I wanted to introduce the idea of dominant and recessive traits. I wanted to do it in a way that was fun, in a way that was kid friendly. And so, as you said, the first day of science, they get into groups and they draw monster families, and that's all that they're supposed to do. But the kids start to intuit that if it's going to be a family, they probably have some things in common. Um, they wouldn't look exactly the same, but maybe they'd have similarities. And there's a discussion of how um, sometimes families form in different ways. Families might form through adoption or all kinds of different ways. So you can also have people in your family that maybe don't look a whole lot like you. So they end up having these discussions um, on their own as well. And as a former teacher myself, I think that's what I always strive to do with lesson plans, is to set something up so that I'm not just telling kids things, so they can discover them on their own. And then as a teacher, you can bolster that kind of intuitive and problem solving sort of thinking.
And so, this idea of drawing the monsters and creating families, and then also seeing how families have similar traits, also gets Mr. C into talking about kind of the main crux of the book, which is how humans share 99% or greater than 99% genetic material. And that is something
hmm
that sparks within Georgia. Can you talk a little bit about your own connection with this scientific fact and how that inspired Georgia Watson and the 99% campaign?
yeah, so an interesting little tidbit is that the first 7 versions of this book did not have a 99% campaign in them. When I had an agent at the time and she submitted the book to 4 different publishers, one of the concerns was that they didn't think there was enough of a marketing hook, even though it was about genetics and we thought that was a marketing hook, but it wasn't enough of one. So I spent a couple of months thinking about what could make the book more distinctive. I did some research. I just played around on the computer, and then I found out that we are more than 99%, connected at a cellular level, and I thought that was amazing, and it really dovetailed with another piece of my life, which is that I am a volunteer with an organization called Braver Angels, which is a political depolarization group. So, Braver Angels brings together people from all sides of the political fence for constructive conversations. And I have found that when I participate in these events, um, people who I think maybe I just don't understand, how could they possibly think what they think? It turns out that we have a lot more in common than I thought, and oftentimes, even politically, we are closer together than we think they are. So it's become a theme in my life that I'm pretty passionate about.
And I'd like to touch on something because I do enjoy going into sort of the business side because a lot of people may be aspiring writers, especially young readers, may want to someday explore writing as a possible career. You said that
Right.
in the initial drafts, the feedback that you had received for Georgia Watson was that it needed a marketing hook. As somebody who
Mhm.
worked as an educator and as somebody who was already publishing picture books, can you give a little bit of your insight how it feels to be told that there needs to be a marketing hook, something that just may
Yeah.
not come intuitively?
No, it sure didn't. Um, that was hard because the other piece of feedback I had gotten was that the emotional stakes weren't high enough, and that, after some thought and rereading, I had a bunch of ideas about how to, intensify the plot and the emotional arc of Georgia. But I was really stumped about the marketing hook. And I worked with a wonderful freelance editor named Deborah Halverson, who is a genius. And she read through my manuscript and gave me some ideas, and then very generously had a couple phone calls with me. And I still couldn't figure it out. And she finally said to me, "Look at it this way. When somebody thinks about your book, you want them to think, oh, that's the book about fill in the blank. That's the book about the boy wizard, or that's the book about the boy with Treacher Collins syndrome or whatever." And my book at the time was sort of that's the book about the girl who loses her friend and gets her friend back. There are a million books like that. Like, what is my fill in the blank? And I went, "Oh, that's what you're talking about." It was such a wonderfully concise way to summarize what that was. And that's when I went on my journey for, well, what am I filling in the blank? And it's, that's the book about the 99% campaign. So, and it's something that kids can actually do. They can do with their friends. A teacher can do it in their classroom. A school can do it, have a 99% campaign week. Um, so it's an actionable, I think, hopefully, emotionally boosting activity.
And when it comes to having actually gotten this book out, which did come out last year, from the reader response and from school visits, have you seen people that participate in the 99% campaign making their own collages of sticky notes?
um, So far, I've seen some classrooms do some things. I am, and then I've done. In this fall, I did a couple of book clubs, and I have some branded sticky notes that I give out to the kids. So I'm hoping that they're doing it with their friends as well. Um, but yeah, I'm hoping that this coming school year that I'll have some schools or some classrooms that sort of formally do a 99% campaign. That would be a lot of fun.
A lot of times when structuring a story, you sometimes tend to think of it as the good guy versus the bad guy. And the best stories are those that have a relatable antagonist. And kind of in that degree, I want to talk a little bit about Nicole, who ends up having
Mhm.
her own character arc and has a more sympathetic story than we give credit for in the first half of the book.
Mhm.
Nicole begins the book by approaching Izzy at her home while Georgia is there, and Georgia starts to feel this rift between herself and Izzy. Can you talk a little bit about introducing Nicole and this idea of stealing someone's best friend?
Yeah. Um, I think a lot of that comes from when I was in 3rd grade, there was a girl who's constantly picking fights with me and constantly trying to get all the other girls not to talk to me. So it was a very base instinct in me. I was always worried that she was going to come between me and my best friend or get all the girls not to talk to me and then I'd be all alone. And it's that fear of loneliness again that Georgia has. It's the only person she feels super connected to as the book begins is Izzy. And what if she loses Izzy? um, her life is going to go back to complete, loneliness. So it's a very deep fear, and I think we all have that fear, that and that need for connectedness. Um, so yeah, so it's pretty intense for her.
And so when it comes to building the 99% campaign, the first thing that Georgia is able to do is see herself in Claire, the new girl, being able to say, I moved around a lot. She recently moved. And then there's also Anthony, who is the other person at the first 99% table. And for Anthony, it came a little less naturally. Uh, and it feels like the 99% campaign, this thing that people can do as a group. And I think that that's a wonderful idea. I think that people should introduce this in classrooms because I think it is really sweet. Is that sometimes it does take some introspection to be able to find the commonalities. Can you talk a little bit about creating these kind of background characters or minor characters in the story and being able to draw the connection between Georgia and these characters and other characters, or maybe these characters and yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, interestingly, and I think it just shows that so in the 99% campaign, the idea is to trade sticky notes with people that have something that you share in common. And when my kids were younger in their classrooms, sometimes the teachers would have not campaigns, but days when you'd give people sticky notes that just say nice things like "you're nice" or "you're funny" or whatnot. And it didn't resonate as much with my kids because you could just write "you're nice" and hand them out to everybody, and you didn't really feel any particular connection to anybody. And so that's why I thought um, this is a much deeper level. And when, as I said, for 7 drafts, there was no 99% campaign. So I had already created all of these people. So it's not like I created them looking for ways that they or things that they shared. Um, it was more like real life. Here are a bunch of people. Well, let's see, what do they share? Um, and so it makes it, I think, more tangible for the real world because we are just people out in the world. We're not you know, um, the world isn't crafted to you as a person, and these characters weren't crafted to have necessarily intersections with Georgia. But once I found that idea and I started looking, I saw a lot of connections, and I think that's exactly the message. I don't want to be a messagey writer, but hopefully all good books have something affirming to say to kids. And I think the affirming thing that I like to say to kids is if you look at anybody, you have some sort of connection to them, if you really stop and think about it.
I think that that's a very important aspect, as well as something else you said, which was making it tangible, not literally just as in this is an activity that people can do, but this is also something that they can use pragmatically in real life, not necessarily, as I said, as an activity, but just to say there's somebody who maybe you're having a hard time connecting with, similar to Georgia and
Mhm,
Nicole.
mhm,
Even if they're having a hard time making friends, even if it's somebody that in whatever reason you're just struggling to be friends with, or maybe you don't even like, you're able to say that
mhm,
there is something in common with them. And something
mhm,
that I talk about a lot on these podcasts and these interviews is that empathy is an inherent trait, but it's a muscle that needs to be trained. And I think that that
yeah, yeah,
idea of trading sticky notes with positive messages is one of those examples of practicing empathy. And I think that
mm,
for Georgia Watson, having traveled so much and had so little connection, maybe just didn't have the opportunity to practice that empathy outside of her own family and with her grandfather that she unfortunately lost.
mhm, yeah, and I think it's hard, in real life with real people, if there's somebody you have a conflict with, whether, you're in an argument with your best friend or, your parents or, someone about politically or whatever it might be, it's it's much more of a gut instinct to um, find the divisions, honestly. I think as human beings, we're sort of programmed to us, them, and we needed groups back, thousands of years ago. You needed your group to survive. Um, but to take a beat and say, well, okay, I'm having this problem with this person. what do we have in common? What do we share? How can I find a place of commonality to restart this discussion um, in a new way with a new fresh set of eyes?
And it sounds a lot like something that I've heard a lot recently in listening to science, kind of science focused shows of evolutionary empathy, in that groups of animals and groups of early civilizations and groups of early people that were able to work together were more likely to flourish, and therefore they were the ones that more likely survived.
Right.
And that kind of feels
Right.
like it's very much in line with Georgia Watson and the things that she learns throughout sixth grade.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. I like that a lot.
And just to bring this to a close, I have the same question that I ask all guests on the podcast. It's open ended, so feel free to respond as you wish, as well as say any final words that you'd like to. Sarah, the last question is, Sarah, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
How do I see myself? I am inherently a teacher. I was a classroom teacher, I'm a tutor, I've worked with kindergartners through high schoolers. Um, and I think I see all the work that I do as wanting to help kids um, find the better, to make whatever they see in life better and to be a force for good. That's what I'm hoping.
Thank you. That was an interview with Sara F. Shacter. Her book, Georgia Watson and the 99% Campaign, is available now. You can learn more about Sara and her work, as well as additional resources related to the science behind the 99% Campaign, at sarafschachter.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can go to patreon.com at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.